So I'm really pleased to be at the ICPS and talk to such a wide variety of psychologists and introduce you to the value of a comparative approach to cognitive evolution. And I'll start with a quip, the observation that there are two kinds of people in the world, those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who don't. And unfortunately, that's traditionally been somewhat true in the field of animal cognition. There have essentially been these two attitudes towards animal behavior and animal cognition, which I call the exclusivists, who like to focus on the differences between animals and humans. So Aristotle would probably be one of the first. Only humans have rationality, so we are the only rational animals. Or Descartes, who went even further to suggest that animals are essentially robots, and only humans, because of the gift of language, have rationality. Against them, though, were equally luminary people like Voltaire or Hume. This is a great quote by Hume. "No truth appears to me more evident than that beasts are endowed with thought and reason as well as man." So direct contrast to Descartes. And of course, so this is a long-running battle, but in today's world we have on the exclusivist end, people like Noam Chomsky, who has focused on the uniqueness of language relative to other animal cognition and communication, or Danny Povinelli, who we'll be hearing some more about later. At the inclusivist end, of course, most famously, we have Darwin, who really emphasized throughout his career the similarities between humans and animals. Or a modern figure would be Franz de Waal, who has really spent most of his career emphasizing the similarities between us and other primates. Sometimes the inclusivists are criticized, and sometimes with good reason, because of things like this. Some of you may have seen this video series, Animals Are People Too. And it's basically, let's dress up animals in silly outfits and get animals doing amazing things and sort of exercise our anthropomorphism. And so sometimes exclusivists rightly criticize this anthropomorphic attitude towards animals. But the core message that I want to get across to you today is that, in a sense, both of these sides are correct, and that from a modern biological point of view, we really need to turn these ideas on their head and recognize a very simple biological fact. It's a truism that people are animals too. So much of our biology is shared with other species that first and foremost, we have to think of whatever is special about us as built upon a foundation that's shared with many other animals. And just to give a sense, our DNA, the genetic code, RNA, et cetera, is shared with virtually every living thing, from bacteria to daffodils. Our cell structure is shared with almost all other living animals, including the nucleus and many details about cellular physiology. Our nervous system structure is shared with flies and worms, as well as, of course, all other vertebrates. So the basis of our biology is a huge amount of shared fundamentals. But of course, every species is unique. The elephant has its trunk. Bats have their echolocation abilities and really amazing ability to see with their ears. And humans are upright. We have language. We have vocal imitation that other primates don't have. So we can accept both that much of our biology is shared, but also at the same time recognize that each species has their own uniquenesses, and humans are just another species in that sense. And some of our uniquenesses, and the one I'll be focused on tonight, is our ability for language. So that's the sort of, what I want you to get you used to in the rest of this talk is both seeing us as animals and seeing all the stuff that we share with other animals, but also recognizing those things that make us unique and make us special. So always keep in mind this broad variety of species with whom we share various things, from cell structure to most of our brain structure. And let's try and replace this old idea of the scala naturae that goes back to Aristotle, the notion that we can arrange everything in the universe from inanimate, then to plants, then to animals, then to humans, and then we get angels, and then we get archangels, and then finally we have God at the top. This idea of biology as a kind of scale, with us near the top, and this is just a modern version of a sculpture called Scala Naturae, and it's always humans at the top. And I think a modern biological perspective makes that really absurd. And nonetheless, it's an intuition. So this is an intuition that we need to work to eliminate. And the antidote to that, of course, goes back to Darwin. And it's recognizing that life is a tree, and we are one little branch. We're a special branch, but so are platypuses and chameleons, et cetera, et cetera. So taking this tree point of view is really fundamental to taking a modern biological perspective on human cognition. So the approach that my colleagues and I have been pushing, we call it cognitive biology. So we have a department of cognitive biology. That's the name of my professorship. Other people have called this cognitive ethology or cognitive cladistics. But what all of these different names have in common is an attempt to build bridges between basic evolutionary biology, here symbolized by Darwin, with the cognitive sciences, here symbolized by Chomsky and Skinner, psychological and cognitive sciences. This guy down here is Konrad Lorenz, who maybe many of you have heard of. He was an Austrian. He's the founder of the field of ethology, so this is sort of, in a sense, our forerunners. And the goal in all of these cases, even in Darwin's time, but certainly today, is to build these bridges between the psychological, between the cognitive, and the biological perspective. Now, this is not the same thing as evolutionary psychology. I'm sure most of you are aware of evolutionary psychology as initially pushed by Tooby and Cosmides, and then Steve Pinker's book, How the Mind Works, has been a major force in this, for popularizing this. Evolutionary psychology, in contrast to cognitive biology, is very focused on the last 6 million years since we've been separated from all other living species. So essentially seeing the human mind as built during this relatively short evolutionary period. The idea is that we have Stone Age minds that were built in the Pleistocene. And what I want to suggest is that, although not incorrect, is a very incomplete way of thinking about our cognition. And in fact, from a cognitive biological perspective, we want to adopt a very broadly comparative approach, not just comparing ourselves to our nearest relatives, the chimpanzees, but going much further. And I'll show you many examples of why, for example, comparisons with birds can be more illuminating than comparisons with, for example, chimpanzees. So besides this highly comparative approach that I'll be illustrating throughout tonight, the other two main components of the cognitive biological approach are first to divide complex traits like language or music into multiple more basic components, some of which may be shared and some of which may be unique. We call this the divide and conquer, or the multi-component approach. And then the key thing, this is the biologist's part, is to map these components, presence or absence, onto a phylogenetic tree. So that's how we can actually start to rebuild the evolutionary past of particular cognitive abilities. And when we do this, when we find similarities between ourselves and other species, there's two possible evolutionary reasons that those might be there. And the first, and probably most familiar, is called homology. That's when a set of living species share some trait. So for example, we share with our nearest relatives, the great apes, large brains, large body size, long lives, prolonged childhoods. All of those are characteristics that we share with our nearest living species. And the reason we share those is because our common ancestor, which was not a chimpanzee or a gorilla or a human, it was the common ancestor of all the great apes, also had those characteristics. And the beauty of homology is that it enables us, looking at living species, to rebuild the past, to rebuild an extinct common ancestor and ask what kinds of traits that common ancestor would have had. So that's, I think, relatively familiar. The less familiar type of similarity are called analogies or convergent evolution. So an example of this would be, we walk around on two legs as humans, and so do birds. And of course, it's pretty intuitive that independently evolved. Birds, because they develop wings and flight. It's not because the common ancestor of humans and birds was bipedal. So that's an example of an independent evolutionary event. And those are important because in the same way that statistical independence is crucial for testing hypotheses, these provide us independent evidence for the mechanisms and the functional adaptive reasons that a particular trait like bipedalism might have evolved. And throughout tonight, I'm going to give you examples of both homology and analogy. And I want to emphasize the value of analogy in testing evolutionary hypotheses. Okay, so let's start. I want to give you a simple example. This is based on color vision. So as I'm sure you all know, most humans are normal humans are trichromats, and we call that color vision. But most other mammals are dichromats, so we think of that as not having color vision. A dog or a goat, or indeed most other mammals, live in a world where they only have two cone opsins, so they only can distinguish between two different colors, or two color wavelengths. We share with some other primates, including chimpanzees, this trichromacy. Now, if we just looked at that, we might think, trichromacy is a very advanced trait. We, at the top of the scala naturae, share that with a few other highly evolved species, and most species have just dichromacy. But now when we broaden the comparative net a little bit and ask about birds, it turns out that birds not only have trichromacy, they have color vision the way we do, but most birds have tetrachromacy. They have 4 different cone opsins. So immediately we might ask the question, well, okay, is this because there was convergent evolution, like in bipedalism, or is it possible that the common ancestor was trichromatic, had color vision, and some mammals lost it? And the way we answer that question is to broaden the comparative net even further and ask, and what we find is that fish, lizards, birds, amphibians all have tetrachromacy. And that enables us to infer that the common ancestor of all living vertebrates was tetrachromatic. And what happened is that in mammalian evolution, our common ancestor with other mammals lost its color vision. And then what happened is that we primates, some of us, regained a sort of partial color vision. Okay? So that's a quite complicated story. It doesn't fit at all with the idea of a scala naturae with us at the top. In fact, birds have better color vision than we do. They can distinguish colors that we cannot distinguish. Okay? So I think this is a nice example. This is a completely undisputed example at this point because we have all the opsins and the genes. We can even find fossil genes that indicate that mammals once had trichromacy. So this is a very clear example. Let me give you another more cognitive, more psychological example, and this comes from animal tool use. Animal tool use is another thing that has evolved multiple times in multiple different clades of animals. So you can see some of them in there. Some of the more famous are chimpanzees, of course, or otters that use stones to break open shells, dolphins using sponges to protect their head. So there are many different examples of this. But then we also have birds that use tools, and I'll show you some examples of that in a second. So this is a great place where a broad comparative approach looking at both homology and analogy can be of value. So if we start with chimpanzees, our nearest living relatives make tools. They make actually some rather complex tools. They both use grass and sticks for fishing termites and use rocks to crack open nuts. Those are 2 very well-attested examples. And in some cases, some chimpanzee cultures do things like use spears to spear their prey. Okay? So it's very clear when we see that our nearest relative had that our common ancestor with chimpanzees, if we could go back 6 million years, that organism would also be using simple tools of the same sort. Okay? So this is a case where we can use homology to reconstruct our common ancestor, in a sense, go back in time to see what that extinct organism would have been like cognitively. Okay? Now, what about analogy? So this is a beautiful example. In New Caledonia, there are no woodpeckers. So New Caledonia is an island in the South Pacific, rather isolated. And the crows there, because there are no woodpeckers that are specialists at pulling grubs out of rotten logs, these crows have quite uniquely developed this ability to use sticks to probe into holes. So they use tools to do what woodpeckers do with their beaks. And they probe around and they pull out these big grubs. And this has been a really quite exciting area because we can raise these in captivity and see that the propensity to use tools actually has an inborn component, but there's still a learned component. So it's a nice way of looking at nature versus nurture. And I just want to show you one nice example of the kinds of sort of amazing tricks that animals can do. This is a New Caledonian crow that was raised, that was at Oxford University. She's passed away. Her name was Betty. And what you're going to see now, what New Caledonian crows normally do is they use sharp, straight objects as a kind of spear to spear grubs. And you'll see Betty trying to do this. She's been given a piece of wire, which is not a very familiar structure. She's probing around, but the food is too far for her to reach it. So she's spearing, she's trying to get it. There's a little bucket that contains the food there. And she really wants, the food looks really good, she really wants it. But she's not going to get it. This is never going to work. And so what happens now, it was amazing that this was caught. This was the first time she'd ever done this. She inserts the wire into a crevice. She bends it. And now she's made a hook. Still not so easy. And now she gets the food. And that is one happy crow. Yeah. So I confess, this is a bit like the People or Animals 2 videos, but this is real science. So. Okay, and what that shows is that this is not some kind of genetically determined automatic behavior. These are very smart animals, and they do have a capacity to solve tasks and to go beyond whatever their biological predispositions are, in the same way that we do as humans. That's why we can drive cars and make power drills, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this, of course, is analogy. This is convergent evolution. We don't think that our common ancestor with crows was a tool user. But again, this enables us to start asking some other questions. For example, why does tool use evolve? And why has it evolved so many times in all of these different organisms? And what we find, is that in virtually all the species that use tools, they're exploiting an otherwise unexploited resource. So in the case of the woodpeckers, it's unexploited because there happen to be no woodpeckers on New Caledonia. But in all of these cases, it's a way of getting at otherwise unexploitable food, rich food, usually typically fatty, protein-rich, all the good stuff you need to build brains and bodies. And so this enabled the multiple occurrence of this in multiple lineages allows us to address the why question. The why did tool use evolve? And of course that applies in our case as well. Once we became tool users, we were able to exploit all of these new resources that were unavailable to other primates. Okay, so that's my introductory material. What I want to do now for the rest of the lecture is turn to human language, which has been a focus for most of my life, and show you how the same comparative approach that I've just introduced can be used in other species. And again, I want to emphasize, don't try and read all of this, but what I want to emphasize is that if we break language into its component parts, most of those parts are shared with other species, whether it's the ability to learn rules, the ability to form categories, the ability to make concepts, the way our vocal production system or our ears work. There's a huge foundation that we share with other species, sometimes very broadly, even with fish, sometimes much more narrowly with other primates or other mammals. But so even though I'm not going to go through in detail with all of these shared foundations, I want to emphasize that most of the biology that we put to use in language is shared with other species. But there are, of course, some things that we are the only species that has language in the sense of something that enables us to express all of our thoughts. And there are a few specializations that seem to build on this basic foundation to make that possible. And so if we compare humans with chimpanzees, so if we ask what had to evolve since we split from chimpanzees, there are at least 3 different components that clearly differentiate us from our nearest living cousins. I call them signal, syntax, and semantics, but we're really talking about vocal learning, complex hierarchical syntax, and certain aspects of semantics that we're still trying to put a clear handle on. And in the rest of this talk, I want to walk you through each of these to show both the commonalities and the differences in each of these 3 different domains. So starting with speech, as I'm sure most of you know, chimpanzees can't talk. No chimpanzee has ever learned to say even hello, or sing happy birthday, or do even the most basic kinds of things that some other species can do. This is not because chimpanzees aren't smart or aren't able to imitate other things. This was a chimpanzee named Vicky, raised in a human household, and she learned to help with the washing, tie her shoes, drive a car. So she was able to imitate quite a few things, but she was unable to imitate speech. And even with daily training, feeding her a grape every time she came close to making a sound, all she could do was things like hop for cup or ha for mama. So very limited ability to control their vocalizations in other apes. And as far as we know, that's true of all other primates. But of course, we're not unique in being able to imitate sounds. Many animals actually have this capacity to imitate typically their own species sounds, but if raised in a human household, some can imitate human speech. So I'll give you 2 examples. One is more familiar. This is a mynah bird that I met in Ticino in Italian-speaking Italy. You're going to hear me off camera trying my Italian, trying to get him to speak, and then you'll hear the mynah finally imitate me.
Buonasera. Come stai? Come stai?
Come stai?
Buonasera.
Buonasera. Buonasera. Buonasera.
And as I'm sure my Italian colleagues have noticed, the bird has a much better Italian accent than I do. Okay? So an amazing contrast. Here's another example that may be less familiar. So this is a seal. What I'm going to play you now are sounds from a seal whose mother died when he was being born. He was born into the arms of a fisherman and brought home, this was in Maine in the US, raised in the bathtub in this fisherman's house. He ate so much that they named him Hoover. And he got too large and it just got out of control. And so he was donated to the New England Aquarium in Boston, where years later, once he started to become sexually mature and trying to court female seals, he started making the sounds that I'm going to play for you right now.
Hey, oh yeah. Hey, oh yeah. Hey, 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 hey.
Yes, and that really is a seal. So those of you who aren't Americans might not quite recognize what he's saying. He's saying things like, get over here, hey, 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 Hoover, with a strong New England accent. This is a slightly clearer example.
Hey, hey, get over here. Hey, hey.
So, pretty amazing. And again, contrast that with our nearest relatives who can't even learn to say mama, even with intensive training. Stick a seal in the bathtub, expose him to human speech, and he can pick this stuff up. So what we have here is a beautiful example. In all of these cases, we're talking about convergent evolution. So this is a nice case where analogy can really help out. So if we ask, why can't chimpanzees speak? Why do we have this capacity that they lack? There have been two long-running hypotheses. One is that it has something to do with vocal anatomy, the descent of the larynx that Gun mentioned, and the other is that it has to do with neural or cognitive mechanisms that differentiate us. They may both be true, but if we treat those as contrasting hypotheses to start, we've known for a long time that humans are unusual in that our larynx has descended in our throat. So you can see this over here. This is the larynx that's been pulled down in the throat, almost as if we've swallowed our larynx, pulling the back of the tongue with it. By comparison, most mammals have their tongue resting in the oral cavity, and the larynx is quite high and can engage in the nasal cavity. So this is a weird thing about our species. We have this lowered larynx, and a long-running hypothesis has been that this is why we can speak and a chimpanzee can't. But I think this old hypothesis was based on static anatomy. So one of the things that I started doing when I was a postdoc was asking, what do animals actually do with their vocal tract when they're communicating rather than when they're dead or when you've cut their head in half? And the answer, it turns out, is quite interesting. It turns out that all mammals that we've been able to x-ray so far lower their larynx, sometimes to a human-like position, as you'll see in a moment, when they're making loud vocalizations. So this is a dog. You're going to see his larynx, which is right here. So this is the dog's jaw. This is the collar down here. And what you'll see is that during the barks, the larynx is retracted down just for the moment of the bark, and then it pops back up. Okay? So we've seen this in all the mammals that we've looked at, and what that suggests is that this flexibility of the larynx, the capacity to move the larynx up and down, and move it down when you're vocalizing, is a homology that we share with other mammals. So what's unusual about us is not that we have a descended larynx, just that it's down all the time. That's what makes humans unusual, not this flexibility. So then the question is, well, how much of a difference does this really make? To answer that, my colleagues and I, Asif Ghazenfar and Bart de Boer, recently published this study that's taken us a long time to do. We got macaques to, in an X-ray setup, to make various vocalizations, to chew and swallow, and to make their species-typical facial gestures. We traced those, we then modeled those with a computer algorithm, and then we used that to pull out the formant frequencies, which are the key characteristics of vowels. So basically, this was a way of asking, what can a monkey's vocal tract do, even if the monkey is not actually using it in vocalization? And what we found is basically this very large vowel space. Some of the corners, some of the outlines of this space are vocalizations, but others are non-vocal displays that the monkey does. So what we see is a very large range of possible formant patterns. And we can ask, well, how does that compare to a human vowel space? So what we have here are, let's just focus on the first formant versus the second formant. This is the human vowel space. This was the earlier inferred capacity of a rhesus macaque based on dead animals, based on static anatomy. And this is the actual vowel space that we were able to pull empirically from these X-rays that I showed you. Okay? So what you can see is that the actual vowel space is very large and almost comparable to that of a human's. You might still say, well, it's not the same as a human. So of course a monkey, if we gave a monkey the right brain, it wouldn't necessarily be able to talk like a human. But so what we did was we synthesized what a human and a monkey with the same source would sound like. So this is my wife, resynthesized.
Will you marry me? Will you marry me?
So that's a human, a normal human. I can attest. And this is our monkey model doing its best to imitate that.
Will you marry me?
Okay?
Will you marry me?
And I hope you all agree, it sounds weird, it sounds different, but it's perfectly understandable. So the point of all this is that the limitation that's keeping non-human primates or other animals from speaking is not their vocal tract anatomy, rather it's something in the brain. So we end up now at hypothesis 2. Yeah, that got picked up by the press. That we used that particular phrase was led to a lot of interesting press. So it's not the vocal anatomy that's crucial, it's something in the brain, so we can ask, well, what might that be? And again, there's been a long-running hypothesis. The idea is that most mammals have only indirect connections from their motor cortex to the neurons that control the vocal tract, the larynx, the tongue, etc. So in a cat or a dog or a chimpanzee, these connections need to go through middlemen, interneurons, before they get to the actual final outputs. In humans, we still have those sort of normal mammalian connections, but we also have direct connections that aren't present in other primates, direct connections from our motor cortex onto the motor neurons that control the larynx. So the hypothesis is, based on comparisons of humans and other primates, that this is what makes us special. This is the key thing that gives us the kind of control over our vocal tract that a chimpanzee lacks. But you might say that's a kind of N of 1 comparison. We have one set of species that can't, one species that can. Can we test this hypothesis? And that's where we come back to the fact that vocal learning has evolved multiple times in parallel in all of these different species. This is still probably not the full list, but we know right now that some bats, all elephants, some seals, probably most cetaceans, and several different clades of birds all have independently evolved the capacity for vocal learning. Okay? I showed you the myna and the seal before. So what this enables us to do is test this direct connections hypothesis. The prediction is, of course, that these vocal learning species should also have these direct connections from motor cortex down, if that hypothesis is correct. And that has been tested now in 2 different bird clades, in songbirds and in parrots, and in both cases, that prediction holds up. So the bird's anatomy is different. They use a syrinx rather than a larynx, and of course they don't have the same cortical arrangement as we do. But those birds that are vocal learners have direct connections from their equivalent of motor cortex down to the motor neurons. And other birds that aren't vocal learners, like doves or chickens, don't have these direct connections. So now what we've done is added several more data points to this comparison, and therefore, the prediction is upheld. So I think this direct connections hypothesis is the best game in town. Not that this is the only difference that this would lead to speech, but that this gives organisms the kind of control over their vocal tract that you need to be able to imitate sounds in your environment. Okay, So my general conclusion here is that by taking a very broad comparative perspective on a wide range of different species, this really gives us a powerful tool to both develop hypotheses and also to test those hypotheses. And we can test both mechanistic and functional or evolutionary hypotheses. But many of you must be thinking, well, speech is just one way we communicate linguistically. I have a nice demo right here. Of course, everyone in this room can read, so we can communicate linguistically with the written word, and some talented people can communicate via sign as well. So speech is not the only way that we communicate linguistically. So let's get closer to the heart of language and start talking about semantics and syntax. So starting with semantics, again, just to emphasize the broad commonalities, if we look at the field of animal cognition today, what we see is a huge range of shared abilities with other species. And this includes things like having a memory, place memory, short-term working memory, long-term memory, forming categories, having basic emotions like anger, being able to form plans that have goals, being able to learn rules. I'll give you some examples. So what all of this work indicates is that these kinds of basic concepts, nonverbal concepts, predated language by many millions of years of evolution. And the inference then is that Hume was right, that basically animals have concepts. What they don't have is a way of getting those concepts out. So the main difference that we have from other species is not that we have something to think about, but rather that we can communicate what we think about. And of course, we use language to do that. It may be connected with the complex concepts that we have, but we're not at all alone in having concepts. So what is unusual? What is special about us? So one of the kind of leading characteristics that we know is very important and very highly developed in our own species is so-called theory of mind, the ability to form a representation of others' minds. And this is central to social cognition in humans, being able to know what others think and knowing that they know that you know what they're thinking, etc. We do this all the time. It's crucial for our social interactions, but it's also crucial for language. It's a fundamental part of pragmatics and semantics. So what about other animals? What do we know about theory of mind? Are animals able to represent others' minds? So the story for a long time came from Daniel Povinelli's lab and a really pretty compelling series of experiments on chimpanzees showing that chimpanzees really don't seem to have a clue about even the most basic thing, that seeing equals knowing. So the kinds of, these are just, he's done many different experiments along these lines, but these are some of the most striking. If you give, there's food here, and the chimpanzee is given a choice to beg for that food from two individuals, one of whom's wearing a blindfold, and one of whom has the blindfold over their mouth instead, but can see. Or same situation now with a bucket over their head, or the bucket beside them. And the chimpanzees are random. They randomly choose from, or beg from those two individuals. And that's just kind of hard to believe. I mean, how can an animal that's that smart be that stupid in this situation? And that led to a pretty long-running belief that we really are unique in having a theory of mind. Even at this basic level, chimpanzees are not able to represent that others' eyes tell you what they know. And that was overturned. The beginning of the overturning of this was in 2000 when Brian Hare did a clever experiment using a competitive situation between two chimpanzees rather than between humans and chimpanzees. And the basic story is this. You've got a dominant individual that always gets what it wants, and now you have a subordinate. And the subordinate is given it can see the dominant, and it can see that there's food hidden behind an obstacle. And you give the subordinate a slight head start, and every time it runs for the hidden food, and lots of controls can be done where you have different food, and basically it seems very clear that the subordinate is able to tell that this occluder means that the dominant can't see it. So when that was first published, that was very exciting because it seemed to suggest maybe chimpanzees aren't so stupid after all, but our experiments weren't in the right kind of social milieu to bring out their abilities. But there are problems with these experiments. This has been a long-running debate now for 15 years, and one of the kind of really hard, the killjoy explanation that makes it seem like it's not theory of mind or that eyes tell you about knowledge, but rather that they have a simple behavioral rule: avoid eyes of dominance, don't look in their eyes, and don't look at anything that they've looked at. So if they've looked at something, it's tagged by the evil eye. And this was Povinelli and Celia Hayes, who's been a very constructive exclusivist in this whole debate, so really hammering on the methodological details. And like I said, this has been a long-running debate, but I think it's nearing a resolution, not from chimpanzee. Well, the chimpanzee work has progressed, and I think it's very convincing as well. But now I want to show you some bird cases. The first case of this was work done by Nikki Clayton, and the key observation is that some birds, smart birds like corvids, these are jays, corvids are the ravens, crows, jays, etc., and these guys cache their food. So if you give them some food and they're not hungry, the first thing they'll do is go and hide it. And what Nikki did was give birds a situation where one bird was hiding the food, the cacher, and then another bird could observe it, seeing where that cache was, and then they'd let that second bird go and raid the cache, so they could steal the food that the other guy had hidden. Those birds that had the experience of stealing from other birds, but not naive birds, now if we put them in the situation of being cachers, where they're being observed, they would cache the food, look at the observer, and then when the observer went away, they would recache the food. They would re-hide the food. Okay, so this is the idea that it takes a thief to know a thief. So this is, again, it can't be some innate thing, because it only happens if they've had this experience. So I think this goes a long way. You can still tell some sort of evil eye type stories, but it's starting to get a little more convoluted because now we have this experience dependent component. But my colleague Thomas Bugnar, working together with a philosopher, came up with a very clever paradigm, a methodology to get at this, now using another smart corvid species, the ravens, which also are food cachers, also live in very complex social groups. And here's the experiment. It's really clever. So the idea is we want to get the same behavior without the bird ever seeing an eye, without there being any evil eye ever present. So first we have a baseline condition where a bird can observe another one hiding food, and they can each see each other. This guy will hide the food very quickly and then re-hide the food, just like as I told you with Nikki's birds. But if there's an opaque barrier there, he shows a different behavior. He takes his time hiding the food, makes a really perfect cache, does a lot of re-hiding, et cetera, et cetera. And now here's the crucial control. Now we give them a peephole so that they can look out and have experience watching other birds cache. So this bird is now in the experience of being the thief who can use this peephole and then go steal the food. And now we come to the crucial condition. We are going to have this same bird who has that experience. He knows about the peephole, and now he's over here. There's actually not a bird there, but the peephole is open, and Thomas played the sound of a raven flapping. So he had every reason to believe that there could be a bird over there watching him through the peephole. And then they show basically the behavior that they show as if they're being observed. So if we compare the non-observed versus the observed, we see that they take their time in the non-observed condition. And now when we add the peephole condition, there's no significant difference between when they can actually see the observer and when they're just imagining that there's an observer there because they see this peephole. So that really knocks that hypothesis out. I think this is the current gold standard. Celia Hayes accepts this as really knocking out the evil eye hypothesis. And so what I think this shows you is the way in which both the inclusivists and the exclusivists go back and forth, but we can have a very productive debate that leads to improved methodologies. And finally, I think that at the end of the day, what we've got is a situation where at least chimpanzees and some bird species are able to form a basic theory of mind and understand that seeing equals knowing and represent that mental state. Okay. So I want to end by talking about syntax. You guys are having to really work here, so I'm sorry I talk so fast. Syntax, of course, we can all agree that semantics is important for language, but syntax is really at the heart of language. So now I think we're getting to something that without syntax, you really can't have modern human language. Again, we can ask about apes and what are their capacities, and as I'm sure most of you know, even though apes are very limited in their vocal abilities, their gestural and sign communication abilities with their hands are much better. And so various apes have been raised and trained with sign language. They don't actually learn sign language, but they're able to learn some signs. In other cases, like Kanzi uses a keyboard to communicate. But in all of these cases, the apes can learn a large vocabulary, hundreds of vocabulary items, and they use them to communicate. But most of these communication are basically requests. Give me food, tickle me, let's play. and the level of syntax that they attain is that of a young 2-year-old. So basically putting two words together in a particular order. Okay, so a very limited level of syntax. But it's still syntax, so we have something there in common. But what I want to emphasize in the rest of this talk is the importance of hierarchical syntax, of the ability to build hierarchical structures in language. So let's take this simple sentence: the boy who kicked the dog chased the girl. And just to see if you're awake, I'm going to ask you all, who chased the girl? Anyone? I can't hear you. The boy, right? We understand English, we understand language, and we know that even though there's all this stuff in between, we interpret this sentence as having a hierarchical structure where the subject is the boy and the girl is the object, and this is just a kind of modifier. But now imagine we give the same sentence to Kanzi, and he says, look, it says right here, the dog chased the girl. There's a sequence of words that says the dog chased the girl. So you couldn't blame Kanzi for thinking, okay, maybe it's the dog. So the key point here is that we don't interpret language as a string of words, not just as a sequence of words, but instead we interpret these strings of words as having a higher order hierarchical structure. And that's crucial for human language. Without that, we couldn't have the kind of complex communication that we have. So how do we get at this? How do we get at syntax from a rigorous methodological empirical point of view? So a lot of the work in this field has been done using artificial grammar learning. The idea is that you basically expose organisms to a set of stimuli, and then you expose them to after that's the training set, and then you expose them to a new set of stimuli and ask what kinds of patterns have they learned from that original training set. Many of you will be familiar with Jenny Safran's work, Gary Marcus's work. There's a very large tradition in using this kind of approach now. So in this particular field, to get at this question of hierarchical grammar, what a lot of people have been using are grammars that have essentially a sequential structure. So this is a very simple grammar called AB to the N, which means repeat AB as many times as you want. Okay? So just put one B after one A, and then do this as many times as you want. Okay? It's a very simple sequential grammar. From a computational level, it uses the simplest level of so-called finite state grammar, so really easy to build, really easy to make a computer program do this. And as you'll see, many animals can do this kind of thing as well. The more complex grammar, so-called context-free grammar, has been represented in many of these studies by this grammar, A to the N, B to the N, which means the number of A's and B's must match. And crucially there, what you need to do in order to comprehend this is make some representation of the A's and the B's, at least represent the number of them, and then compare those two representations. And that provably, from a computational point of view, requires this higher level of rule structure called a context-free grammar. And so by pitting the AB to the N against the A to the N, B to the N, we can compare what organisms can do this and what organisms can do this. And in the first study that I did, this was together with Mark Hauser when I was still a postdoc at MIT. We did this first. Let's look at the top. This is the sequential rule, the AB, AB, AB. And both humans and monkeys are able to, when exposed to that rule, are able to then generalize that successfully to novel strings that follow that rule. And the humans show that by saying, yes, it's like the other ones, or no, it's not. The monkeys show that by looking more to violations. They turn their head more frequently to violations of that pattern. Okay, so far so good. Both humans and monkeys can learn this basic sequential grammar. Now when we turn to the hierarchical grammar, this context-free grammar, A to the N, B to the N, again, humans have no problem. And this has been now replicated in many different labs. Monkeys can't do it. We have yet to have any species that can successfully do this. So this was just one species, but now these experiments have been repeated in a wide range of different species. So A to the N, B to the N in this case was beyond something that the animals could do. Now, one of the criticisms of this kind of experiment, this was done like the Safran or Marcus experiments, this was done with human speech. So it was a woman's voice and a man's voice, and they were putting these strings together. So the first thing you might ask is, well, why are you using human speech with monkeys? Maybe if you did it with monkey sounds, it would work better. Looks like that's not the case, but that hasn't been published yet. So let's get away from this problem with using speech. Let's get away from the issues that come up with using sequential structure in sound, which means there may be working memory constraints, and turn to a much simpler and much more abstract set of strings, which are now implemented in the visual domain. And this is work that was started by Nina Stobbe, Uli Aust, and Gesche Westphal Fitch in my lab. The idea is exactly the same. So now we have strings, and we're talking about the same grammars, AB to the n versus A to the n, B to the n. But now the A's are represented by these little abstract shapes. The B's are these sort of rounder shapes. They're differentiated on many different domains. So this is AB, 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 right? And now this is A to the n, B to the n. 2 A's, 2 B's, 3 A's, 3 B's. Okay? Everybody see the analogy there with those. And so we ran this with humans, with pigeons, who need no introduction. They're famous laboratory birds. They're not the most clever birds, but they have color vision. They like to work they'll peck on a screen for a long time. So we didn't have particularly high hopes for the pigeons, but these birds are much more unique. We have the world's largest colony of these outside of New Zealand. This is the kea, a New Zealand parrot species, very large-brained, long-lived, very manipulative species, very clever and creative. If you ask New Zealanders, they're famous for outsmarting pets and doing mean things. So keas are really smart birds. And we had good reason to believe that at least the keas would succeed now that we've leveled the playing field. So now there's no human specificity. All the images are there at the same time, so there's no big working memory constraint. And what we found, to make a long story short, and the approach is the same, expose the animals to a bunch of stimuli that follow the rule, and now probe them with new stimuli that either follow or violate that rule. And we asked them to discriminate between those. And what we found, the pigeons are able to basically learn the task, but they don't really generalize very well. But the keas, on the other hand, do very well. They're able to generalize to new colors, to new shapes, to new orientations. They can do it without color, though it's hard for them. But then we come to the crucial tests, particularly for the A to the n, B to the n. To show that an animal has learned that, we have to show that they reject 2 A's and 3 B's, or 3 A's and 2 B's. So it's not enough to just sort of see that there's some A's and then some B's. A to the n, B to the n means an exact match. And we know that these birds can have a number sense, and they can subitize up to 4. So that's not the real problem here. What we found is that the birds can extend to, the keas can extend to longer length stimuli, but they completely fail to discriminate between balanced and unbalanced stimuli. And we were really disappointed about this. I mean, it takes a long time to run these experiments, so all my postdocs were really depressed. So then we thought, okay, let's try and train them. Now we're going to give them the correct thing on one side, the unbalanced comparable stimulus on the other side. And they have to keep trying that same set of stimuli until they get the right answer. Then they get a food reward, and then they can go on to the next trial. And even with that intensive training for weeks, the keas still failed to make what to us is a very, very simple symmetry discrimination. So what this leads us to, and you might ask, what are the keas doing? And we can take, because we have a lot of data from each bird, we can use a model comparison Bayesian format to ask, what did these birds learn? And what you'll see is that all of the birds formed one of 2 very simple rules, work perfectly well to get them peanuts for the training sessions. Either it starts with A's or it ends with B's. And that's what they learn. And occasionally a human being will learn that rule, but most human beings exposed to the exact same set of stimuli, we just induce this rule that the A's and the B's must match. Okay? So once they've got that rule, they just can't get out of it. Okay, and that's work done by my former PhD student, Andrea Ravignani. So where this leaves us right now is lots of different species have been shown to do various finite state grammars, these simpler sequential grammars. But right now, the only good evidence for anyone going beyond that to the context-free level, to this next higher hierarchical level, is for human beings. So that leads us to what may be a real difference between us and other species, and of course would be crucial for human language. And we call this the dendrophilia hypothesis, the idea that humans are born with a love of trees, that we have a species-typical capacity and a propensity to basically infer tree structures. When we are given a sequence, we can't help but interpreting those as hierarchical and interpreting those in terms of chunks and comparing those chunks. And the work that I've shown you with this visual stuff, but also work from music, indicates that this is not something that's specific to language. This is a multi-domain ability that extends at least into these to visual and non-linguistic auditory stimuli. So we think that this may be one of the things that really makes humans weird. This gives us this higher level of syntax above the finite state level. Okay, so that's an idea, that's a hypothesis. It's consistent with the current data, but there's lots more species that we haven't tested. We're still actively working on this hypothesis. But you might ask, okay, if this really is something special about humans, what are the brain bases for these? And I think, again, we have a nice hypothesis. The basic idea computationally is that in order to go to this next level of grammar, to get hierarchical levels, you need to add an additional form of memory, something like a push-down stack or something even more powerful than that. So normal animals have this whole system, but we have added an additional abstract form of memory that enables us to keep track of phrases even after they're over. And the hypothesis is that this is tied to Broca's area. So Broca's area is, I'm sure many of you are aware, it's the inferior frontal gyrus. It's this part that we have on both the left and the right side. This is the most expanded area of the human brain relative to chimpanzees that we know about. So it's increased 7-fold in size in us compared to chimpanzees. And I think perhaps more importantly, it's much more interconnected with the rest of the brain, with the parietal cortex, and temporal cortex, than it is in a monkey or in a chimpanzee. Now, if you want to, I have the data slides afterwards, but I'm running out of time. So if you want to see those data, I can show you. So what we have then is a cognitive hypothesis, this dendrophilia hypothesis, as well as a potential neural substrate, again, consistent with a whole set of data about what might have happened. So it's not some magical new area, it's an expansion of an existing area and an increase in the connectivity in the sort of social network of that particular area. But that could be enough to push us into this new domain, this new abstract domain, is I think a pretty reasonable hypothesis for what happened, what gives us these syntactic abilities. Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour. Just to summarize, I hope to have shown you that comparative studies of a large range of vertebrates, not just comparing humans and primates, but a wide range of other species, is really relevant to understanding our own cognition. When it comes to speech, it's really the neural, but not the anatomical factors that are central. When it comes to semantics, certainly most animals have concepts, and at least some organisms, like chimpanzees or ravens, have some basic theory of mind. So this might be a case in semantics where we just have more than other species, but there's no sort of fundamental qualitative difference. But for me, the most sort of exciting possibility is that, again, in syntax, we share a lot, but there's a relatively small difference in terms of brain architecture made a big difference in terms of our cognitive ability. That's this dendrophilia hypothesis. So we're born with this capacity and propensity to see tree structures wherever we go, across different domains, socially, musically, or linguistically, and that's what gives us the syntax. Put all these things together, and you get the full package of language. So I want to end with another quote. It's I think there's a certain grandeur in seeing our commonality with other species. So this is a beautiful quote from a 19th century writer. "As for me, I am proud of my close kinship with other animals. I take a jealous pride in my simian ancestry. I like to think I was once a magnificent hairy fellow living in the trees and that my frame has come down through geological time via sea jelly and worms and amphioxus, fish, dinosaurs, and apes. Who would exchange these for a pallid couple in the Garden of Eden?" Thank you very much.